This 78th episode of Community Sanctorum, it's the second overview where we pause to sum up the journey that we've taken since the last overview back in episode 40. Now that summary began with the Apostolic Church and ran up through the 5th century, marking the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This overview is going to start where that left off and bring us up to the 15th century. We're about to move into the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation era, but we have a bit more work to do in looking at some trends that took place in the church in Europe in the waning decades of the Middle Ages. It turns out there was a lot of reform-oriented activity that took place in the church well before the birth of Martin Luther. And so we're going to take a look at that, filling in some of the holes that have been left in the story so far. The reason these overviews, these review episodes are important is because of the need to set the events of church history into the larger context of world history. But a danger lies in the very thing that many dislike in a study of history, and that's the inevitable list of names and dates. We have an advantage here because the assumption is you like history, or why for goodness sakes would you be watching? I sure hope that no homeschool student has to watch these and no parent uses them as a form of discipline. Although I guess they could be used in a kind of an enhanced interrogation technique. Anyway, here we go. Picking up where we left off in the last overview. Christianity came to England early at the end of the 3rd century. Patrick, you'll remember, took the gospel to Ireland in the 5th century. The Goth and Hun invasions of Europe altered both the political and religious landscape. As the political structures of the Western Roman Empire fragmented, people looked to the church to provide leadership. Being generally capable leaders, the task of providing governance fell to the dozens of Christian bishops. Then we briefly examined the subject that could have occupied us much longer, the emergence of the Roman bishop as the pope and de facto leader of the church, at least in the Western church. We spent an episode considering Pope Gregory the Great's monumental impact on the church in the 6th century, how the church proved to be a crucial feature of the Middle Ages, and how Augustine's work on theology formed the intellectual core of that era. We charted the faith's expansion into Africa, Mesopotamia, Asia, and the Far East. Charlemagne's tenure as Holy Roman Emperor was reviewed. The iconoclast controversy in the Eastern Church was covered. And then we saw the rift between the Eastern and Western churches that occurred in the 11th century. The Crusades occupied us for several episodes, the growth of monasticism several more, as we took a closer look at both Francis of Assisi and Dominic. We were fascinated by the career of the brilliant Bernard of Clairvaux. We attempted an examination of 2 major controversies, the investiture and the Eucharistic controversy. Universities were founded, the 2 most important being at Paris and Oxford, but several lesser schools as well, giving rise to the movement known as scholasticism. Scholasticism was fueled by the early work of Anselm and Abelard, but it really took off with the labor of Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus. Thomas Becket was made the Archbishop of Canterbury and then killed by overzealous knights. In the late 12th century, Peter Waldo started a movement of mendicants that would birth a movement that lasts until today. We haven't said much about that yet, but we will in a near episode. The Third Lateran Council met in 1179, and a Middle Eastern church known as the Maronites made common cause with the Roman Catholic Church rather than the Eastern Orthodox. In 1187, Saladin captured Jerusalem and the Third Crusade set out. Innocent III became the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages and convened the monumental Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. A crusade was launched against the Cathars in southern France. King John issued the Magna Carta. Pope Gregory IX appointed the first inquisitors, another episode of church history that we need to devote an episode to. Now, coming up to recent episodes, we looked at the emerging tension between the church and state, between popes and princes. That was a harbinger of Europe's emergence into the modern world. Pope Boniface VIII's papal edict, Unum Sanctum, in 1302, was the proverbial gauntlet hurled at the foot of the secular power, denying salvation to anyone outside the church. We reviewed the Great Papal Schism when there was, count them, not 1 nor 2, but for a time, 3 popes. In 1312, the Knights Templar were suppressed. 9 years later, the Italian poet Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy. In 1337, the 100 Years' War began, and a decade later, the plague killed off a third of Europe. Then, as we start to move inexorably toward the emergence of serious reform attempts, we saw the central place of sacramentalism in the mindset of the people of the Middle Ages. The idea that salvation is free and by grace, but that grace is dispensed through the church by the clergy performing sacraments. One episode looked at the mystics who managed to keep the focus on God while it seemed much of the rest of the clergy had been consumed by the intrigues of European politics. We paused to see what was happening with the Mongols and their rapacious conquest of the East, and ended up with a look at John Wycliffe, morning star of the Reformation. It's important we understand the reform of the church was not something that began with Martin Luther in the 16th century. Far from it. There had been many reform attempts in the century and a half before Luther that went far to prepare the ground for his emergence. Jesus spoke of the problem of wineskins. New wine needs a new skin. If you put new juice in an old skin, as it ferments, the already stretched bottle will burst, ruining both the skin and the wine. No, Jesus wasn't giving winemaking lessons. He illustrated a spiritual axiom. When God does a new thing, he often goes outside the current religious skin, the existing structure, and uses a new vessel, a new medium or method. From one perspective, we could say that church history is a long tale of fresh movements of the Spirit and how the faith has embodied or given expression to those new movements. The challenge of the modern student of history is to avoid layering back onto history our own particular experience and evaluations. People with smartphones and the internet with its vast searchable electronic encyclopedia literally at their fingertips could easily consider people just 100 years ago to be terribly uninformed, and people 500 years ago to be bereft of knowing much of anything. It was said that the brilliant polymath Thomas Young, who died in 1829, was the last man to know everything. Now, what that meant is that until the early 19th century, the body of information available in the form of books, the repositories of knowledge, of course, for that time, was of such a nature that a single human being could potentially have at least a working knowledge of all of it. But after that, the proliferation of knowledge began to grow exponentially so that it simply became impossible for one person to have such knowledge. We don't need to attempt such a knowledge upload today when we can download any piece of knowledge that we need in an instant. I say all of that as a preface for this. As we soon move in our episodes into the Reformation era and the breakaway of the Protestants from the Roman Church, it's easy for us who've lived so long with the tension between Roman Catholics and Protestants to project that paradigm back onto the church before the Reformation. And that would be wrong. Before the Reformation, there really was just one church in Europe, and we ought not call it Roman Catholic because what we think of today as the Roman Catholic Church was not that. The Roman Catholic Church of today is what it is in good measure because of the Reformation, as we'll see. Western Christians today probably ought to understand the Church of Europe before the Reformation as our church, regardless of what your denominational stripe is now. Eastern Christians, of course, look to the Eastern or the Greek Orthodox Church as their church and have for 1,000 years. While Far East Christians, that is the few that are left, we've called the Church in the East, but really call themselves by a bunch of different labels, none of which are really helpful to outsiders. The point is, the numerous attempts at reform prior to the Reformation were all kept in-house. Most of the monastic movements were attempts at reforming, not just the monasteries, but the entire church. Some of the popes had a reform agenda and were able to accomplish somewhat in the way of getting the church back to its apostolic ideal. The Reformation split the church precisely because of a perfect storm of several factors that combined in Europe when it was obvious to just about everybody that there was something seriously wrong with the leadership of the church. And when the church wouldn't install the reforms it so obviously needed, a door had opened to allow those who wanted out to finally leave. The factors that contributed to that perfect storm were, first, the growing tension between popes and princes. As the investiture controversy made clear, there had been strife between secular rulers and the Pope for a while. It all went back to Charlemagne and his descendants, who ruled by having their crowns bestowed by the Pope. Their rule was sanctioned by the church. But as the different rulers of Europe jostled with each other for territory and wealth, it became more important to fielding ever larger armies that those rulers competed with the church for income. As the borders of Europe became thicker, the tension between church and state grew. Second, the emergence of the European middle class meant that feudalism that had dominated European politics and economics began to lose its grip on society. Though the social structure was still tightly controlled, new options began to appear. The emerging middle class possessed more disposable income, fueling more markets and options. Cities began to grow. More were educated. Questions were asked, and the church, it didn't always have satisfying answers. Third, the printing press arrived, and books began to proliferate. Ideas that had taken months to move from one place to another now were making the trip in days. Fourth, the scandal of the papal schism, with the governance of the church being argued over by three claimants all at the same time, was simply embarrassing to many of Europe's faithful. It was clear to everyone, including the popes themselves, that serious change was needed. This church, divided as it was, could not be what Jesus and the apostles had in mind. So, in the next episodes, we're going to take a look at some of the attempts at reform that occurred in the late Middle Ages that act as precursors, foreshocks, if you will, to the eventual rift that was brought by Luther and his like.